Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this panel in which we will be exploring the implications of the diverse emerging ESG frameworks. And in particular, we want to discuss whether, and if so, how, they could be a risk or an opportunity to financial institutions, especially those based in the global south or emerging and developing economies. My name is David Porteous from Integral Governance Solutions, and I'm joined by three panelists today who bring diverse perspectives to this issue, and I'm going to introduce them shortly. First of all, let me give you a little bit of context about where we come from. My engagement with these panelists came as part of a wider process of landscaping voices of leaders in Southern financial institutions, together with my colleague Jesse Fripp. This was part of a project supported by FMO and the Swiss Capacity Building Facility. Over the past 3 months, we've engaged with more than 30 financial institutions from around the world, banks, fintechs, microfinance institutions, some large, some small, the majority mid-sized, and most of them with a particular concern about their social impact. So we sought to understand their awareness and attitudes, or in short, their voice around this issue of ESG. And today, as we engage with these three particular voices here on the panel, they represent a sample from this wider group. And of course, as part of this, we hope we'll hear from you, and we hope you'll feel free to post questions or comments in the chat, which we'd like to get to, at least in the second half of today's session. So as we start today, let's acknowledge together that this topic of ESG, first of all, is not that well defined yet, but already it's sprawling and rapidly changing. And we've certainly found a wide range of levels of knowledge and familiarity about it in our interviews. So our panel today convenes not so much as experts in particular frameworks or even particular jurisdictions, while they're all based in particular places, but rather as practitioners who are thinking through the implications from their different perspectives. But let's start off by benchmarking your levels of knowledge as participants around this issue of ESG. So please complete this first poll, which asks you about your level of knowledge and familiarity, and that can help us calibrate our conversation today. Now, while we wait for those results, let's build a common starting point about what we're talking about today. So when we talk about ESG, we're using that as a shorthand reference for taking into account how environmental, E, social, S, and governance, G, issues affect companies. And sometimes ESG is also called corporate sustainability. Those terms are often used interchangeably but within different communities. Now, some of these underlying concerns about company social impact go back a long way, 50 years or more in some cases. But in the last 15 years, and especially the last 5 years, the complexity, the scope, indeed the applicability of these frameworks has multiplied. There have been two big forces behind the growth. The one is investors, largely in the global north, where increasing volumes of assets, now estimated at more than $35 trillion, or a third of assets under management in large economies, have come under some form of ESG mandate. So that's the first force. And the second force has been financial authorities, especially bank regulators and capital market authorities. And increasingly, it's financial authorities in the global south as well. Now, using the term frameworks here, what I'm talking about are the numerous sets of principles and guidelines, which are often produced first as voluntary codes at the international level, and which in some cases become standards through the actions of global standard-setting bodies. Recent example of this is the draft sustainability accounting standards published by the IFRS on the basis of a whole lot of work done in previous voluntary standards around disclosure. An example of how these frameworks and standards at the international level then come to affect domestic regulation we can see in Kenya, where the Central Bank of Kenya took the framework of the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Based Financial Disclosures, TCFD, And it used them as the basis to issue guidance on climate risk management for banks last year. This requires all banks in the country to produce a board-approved implementation plan on how they're going to manage climate risk, and then start to report against that plan from June this year. Now, those are just examples. The frameworks are very diverse. Some are very specific to some parts of the E, like climate, for example. Others are very broad, covering all ESG aspects in some way. The common denominator, though, is that they focus companies on assessing and disclosing how these risks affect them, and in some cases, how they affect the risks, the so-called double materiality question. And so that's the context for the general question raised today in the panel title. It's slightly ironic because ESG frameworks themselves require that companies integrate consideration of material risks and opportunities. But the question is, could these frameworks themselves be a material source of risk or opportunity, at least for financial institutions, our focus today? So there could be an opportunity if they provide a way to differentiate and maybe access more capital on better terms. They might be a risk if they impose costs or frictions, or possibly even ration access to capital through forms of de-risking by classes of investor. So today, let's explore the issue with our panel from different perspectives. And let's see also, as we start, what the results are of the poll. I can see that about 71% of you have heard about these frameworks, but would like to understand more, and that's by far the bulk of you. About a fifth saying you're reasonably familiar, and a small group, 7%, who've actually been involved in the application of one or more of the frameworks. And so I hope we'll get to hear from all of you, but it sounds like we're starting from a perspective where most of you have at least heard the term, at least heard about some of them, and would like to understand more. So that's a good place to start with our panelists today. So what I'd like to do is ask them each in turn to contribute the perspective that they bring about what they've encountered so far. So Lauren, if I may, starting with you. Lauren is the investor engagement lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is not itself a standard setting body. She can explain the difference here, but it's certainly an advocate and a benchmarker of good practice with respect to at least SDGs. And maybe, Lauren, you can tell us a bit more about how ESG frameworks affect your work, and in particular, disentangle this question of how does ESG match with SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, thanks, David. That's a really important question to unpack, I think. And the World Benchmarking Alliance doesn't have a set model or framework to explain it exactly, but I think as you hear a little bit about our journey and kind of what we do at the World Benchmarking Alliance, you see how we incorporate these frameworks and unpack them, but then also bring the narrative back to the globally agreed goals, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. So the World Benchmarking Alliance is a public good. We're a not-for-profit. I would encourage anyone really on the call to go and look at kind of what we have on our website and use it as a tool to unpack some of these sustainability themes. But the core of what we're doing is we are producing benchmarks. So we have 7 thematic areas that we produce benchmarks under. We call these systems transformations. And these themes are essentially reflecting themes falling under the SDGs. I won't get into each of them in specific, but essentially in how we choose topics, we're matching large thematic areas to the SDGs and then producing indicators that also are reflective within the SDGs. So our benchmarks, the aim really is to paint a picture of what good looks like in order for companies themselves to meet, again, the Sustainable Development Goals. So they incorporate existing ESG frameworks. That's where we come back to these corporate sustainability frameworks and standards where they exist. So some of those on the call will know some acronyms. A lot of you, I think, won't, according to the polls, so I won't throw them out. So things like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, Global Reporting Initiative Standards, etc. So we incorporate these things and we don't duplicate. So where they're meaningful, we incorporate them again into these comprehensive benchmarks that we produce. But we also go beyond. So in our methodologies and indicators, we do see that these current ESG really frameworks or accountability mechanisms don't always correlate with what society expects from corporations and what society expects corporates to do in relation to meeting the SDGs. So our methodologies are consultative in nature. There's experts, and we have long public review processes, for example. And what we hear back is that these frameworks don't always correlate with meeting those goals. Essentially, they're not always clear enough, and they're not always ambitious enough, I should say. So although not a standard setter or a framework in a traditional sense, our benchmarks really are tools to navigate ESG across sustainability themes. So maybe just before I wrap up on how we're incorporating, a last thing to mention that might be important is this year at COP27, we'll be releasing our first benchmark on the financial system. So that's one of the 7 systems transformations that we look at. So we'll be benchmarking 400 of the largest, so the most influential financial institutions. So the smaller FIs aren't included in this benchmark, but it is globally inclusive. So there's financial institutions from all over the world. And that methodology as well, although I'm situated in the global north, and I do have colleagues all over the global south, but the WBA essentially is globally inclusive. So in our methodology development, we have representatives on our expert review panels, for example, hopefully from many regions in the world. And it should be reflective. These expectations that we produce in the benchmarks should be reflective of what folks can be doing across the world and from a globally inclusive sense. I think I had one more thing to mention. It's fleeting me now. Maybe for smaller FIs, I actually wanted to mention. So again, who you'll see included in these benchmarks are the largest 400 financial institutions. But I do think that when you look at what we have in the benchmarks, how we unpack, again, these sub-themes under the SDGs, there can be things applicable to smaller financial institutions, or under some of our other benchmarks, for example, the one on nature, you can kind of unpack what corporates are expected to do under these themes. And maybe that also is coming back to, David, something you kind of alluded to in the beginning, the applicability and the usefulness of these frameworks. And I don't think there's going to be, one North Star for everyone. But I think that what we try to do in our frameworks is we, again, are sticking to benchmarking these large influential companies, but hopefully providing a roadmap and a language to begin to unpack expectations for other players as well.
Well, thank you. And that report, your financial system benchmark, is something that I think the audience would be very interested to look out for. You say next month around COP time. Yeah. And you've already raised an issue I'm sure we'll head back to in the discussion today, which is whether there's a difference between large and small in the way the effect of these frameworks plays out. Your focus has been, as you said, on the large. So with that, let's go to our second panelist. Let me introduce Nicola Golombek, who is an executive director of Yellowwoods Holdings, which is a holding company of some large companies with substantial operations in the global south in financial services. Insurance is only one of several areas. So Nicola, I know that your group has been concerned about thinking about what one might call sustainability for quite a while. And maybe by way of giving us a sense of how you go about doing that, perhaps give us a sense of how ESG has come into play in that thinking, if at all, so far.
Thanks, David. So I think, as you said, we, as a shareholder group and a private shareholder group with businesses whose origin is in the global south and who continue to operate in the global south, we have, adopted now for the last really 2 decades, a very concerted focus on what we call inclusive and sustainable growth in our businesses, which really we haven't seen as either a risk, perhaps an opportunity, but certainly an imperative, right? So for us, operating businesses, in the zone of tremendous inequality, understanding the economies and that need to grow, that really, when we talk about the role of business in society, we have been focused on that from the point of view of growing the customer bases, making the markets work that our businesses operate in. And we have very much approached that as a collective endeavor. So not really just about managing the risks or opportunities at an individual firm level, but rather trying to build the partnerships and the ecosystems that are needed to actually make the economies that these businesses operate in more inclusive, and more sustainable. So that's been our approach. I mean, what that's meant in practice for our, individual businesses in our portfolio is obviously quite different depending on whether they're insurance businesses, means regulated businesses, financial institutions themselves dealing with investment, dealing with underwriting policies in these emerging economies, as compared to a business like a restaurant business where we're dealing with real economy supply chains that may have an environmental footprint, that may have lots of issues and other aspects of what would now be called ESG. So we have just de facto been engaging with these issues across this portfolio in an emerging and in a global north context. Many of our businesses now operate in the global north as well. And I think it's been really interesting to understand the differences about how these frameworks apply, and even the philosophy of them is different when one is sitting in the global north than in the global south. I mean, I think that ESG, in my view, has come as a way of, I think, the mainstream of capital and the economy, particularly in the global north, I think coming to terms with the imperative of understanding that social and environmental issues are both on the balance sheet of risk and can also in certain instances be an opportunity zone for certain businesses in certain sectors and in certain industries. So for me, this is a positive development because, to be honest, we need significant movement building towards a recalibration of the role of business in society. And we if we have any hope of even the SDGs being a sort of, a glimmer of hope, we're going to need business and capital markets to significantly play a role in achieving those. So of course I think of course we need these frameworks because they are the only way to create movements that actually bring the majority of significant players into the sphere, where we can even have these debates about what's enough, what's too ambitious, what's not ambitious enough. And so that's my one starting point. But the second starting point is that it is really then important to understand how some of the frameworks may or may not impact or work for or against certain global south markets. Certainly there is a risk that in the framing of green deals, for example, in the EU, that could adversely affect trade with Africa, for example, which is where a lot of our businesses are based. So how one has a just transition lens into some of the ways in which these frameworks evolve, particularly around the E, and I would call the S in the E, is really important. And similarly, when one thinks about the ESG frameworks going forward, not just being about risk management on the S, as in not just avoiding the bad things or the harm I'm going to do, but actually requiring positive contribution towards SDGs or towards economic inclusion locally and globally, that the S measures are really meaningful and proportional in the way that I think the E measures are starting to be. So that's my opening thoughts.
Thanks, Nicola. So you really do, through your businesses, bring a kind of bridge, a crossover between northern and southern concerns around this. And already you've introduced another axis of differentiation, building on Lauren's, which I take particularly as the larger, smaller differentiation. You've raised, I think, something we definitely must come back to when we think about the north-south dimension, which is saying in the global south, maybe these are not choices at all, they're imperatives, living in societies with high degrees of inequality, for example, and things that you can't avoid doing. And countries like South Africa, where you're based, countries like India, where I've put a lot of energy and effort already into different forms of quasi-compulsory or compulsory frameworks that correspond to that. So let's get to our last panelist to introduce as we start broadening out the discussion. So Daniel Adoretti is the COO of Possession Africa, a fintech company based in the global south, operating from Nairobi, Kenya, a company which was actually one of the Inclusive Finance 50 just a few years ago, and has just completed a pre-Series A funding round, I understand, Daniel. And so the question to you is, in your context as an operator, practitioner in the Global South, how have you come across these frameworks so far? For example, are investors asking you about them?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. And also thank you much to the panelists. I think I've picked a number of things from what Lauren and Nicole has actually flagged. And from our perspective as an operator, as you put it, David, I think it actually paints a very interesting picture. So I'll probably want to level set a lot of thought processes. So, starting off with Lauren's thought process around large versus small, I think I'll probably see Pesesha a bit more as a small financial institution. So in terms of scale, our balance sheet size is less than $3 million, right? But that paints an interesting picture, because one of the things that we were very intentional on doing when we started the entire business was, how do we directly affect the society itself? Apart from, even if the ethos of our business is completely for profit, one of the big things that we're willing to put on the table was understanding that there's going to be a direct effect in whatever it is that we're trying to do in the market, right? What we actually do is provide credit. And I'm sure there's been a number of news stories around credit providers in this market and how they actually translate in society itself. So that brought up a second thought process. The second thought process was, can we actually use that thought process to differentiate ourselves going forward? So the thought process around the impacts that we actually provide in society, can we use that to differentiate ourselves as you actually go forward? And I guess one of the biggest benefits that I think we have found is, as a small practitioner, we actually seeing that we have a lot of influence in the local communities itself. So we provide credit to micro, small, and medium scale business in Kenya, Ghana, Uganda. We are about to launch in Nigeria in Q1. But we are seeing that, even if we don't have that big balance sheet size, we're actually seeing a lot of influence that we are bringing into that market itself. And that plays directly into the idea of the S and the G that we actually bring to the table, right? So it's quite interesting how I think we're all headed in the same direction at the end. But, it's also quite important. And I'm sure one of the things that we'll talk about in this panel is, one of the voices that we actually do here in this market itself. It's quite important that in the way that all our investors actually view us, one of the biggest positives that I've actually put on the table is the fact that we've had this thought process. The problem has just been the implementation, right? And I think that implementation part has been the biggest bane of operators like ourselves that are in this market. We know that we want to do good. We know that we want to have an effect. The question is, how do we actually do it? And the how becomes quite important, like I said, because our business is a complete for-profit business, but we identify that there's some huge costs to incur to actually end up doing this E, S, and G in a properly standard way. So that's kind of where we come from. We are seeing a lot of influences from our investors. We are seeing a lot of influences from the demand itself. And the beautiful thing is the fact that we also thought about this a lot early. But one of the biggest problems I think we've had is the implementation itself.
Daniel, thank you. It's good to hear. So even as a small institution, you're intentional about your impact already and thinking about these frameworks, but you're raising this how question that does seem to be a big one, because one metaphor that comes to my mind is, particularly on a conference like this, probably a lot of institutions are impact leaning or impact focused, as you are, indeed, as Yellowwood's operating companies are, as we heard Nicola talk about. But it almost feels like by combining all these things together and calling them ESG and translating them into these comprehensive frameworks, one of the risks is, to use a metaphor, it's almost like you could be an athlete who is an absolute star at one athletic event, like the long jump or something. And then suddenly what you're being told is, well, hang on, whoa, before you can compete in your preferred event, you've got to qualify in all these events, or else you can't compete at all. That feels like a metaphor that could apply as we're thinking about this how. You care about impact, clearly, but you've got to think about implementing these frameworks. So let me ask you, Daniel, maybe starting with you, and we'll go back to the others now. One of the questions in people's minds must be the question of, all right, so this has become a big topic. as I said in the framing, all of a sudden ESG is spoken of widely, certainly by investors, increasingly by regulators. Do you think it's a fad? Do you think it's something that's going to go away? And a fad largely started in the North, or do you think there's something more permanent to these ESG frameworks? And then let the others come in on that as well.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it can actually go both ways. I think we do run the risk of it being a fad itself, especially if the ESG ends up being too broad to implement, right? You can easily just lose the momentum and we end up doing, nothing at all. The other reason why I think is also going to be permanent is in a market where we play, so sub-Saharan Africa, it's very difficult for you to, as a business, to absorb yourself from societal impact itself. Because in any kind of solution that you're providing, regardless of the level of the size of your business, you are always going to have that direct impact itself. So at some point, the question is always going to be on your, the question is always going to show up on your financial statements of what particular impact are you actually adding to the society itself. And one of the big questions that businesses in this environment always end up facing is, apart from giving me the direct economic solution that the entire business model is based on, are there other things that you can bring to the table? So an example, I'll probably give an example of Pesesha. Late last year, we wanted to launch microcredits in one of the rural areas in Kenya, right? And we did a quick poll, and it's obvious turned out from all our competitors it was quite difficult to do, right? And it was quite difficult because if you do a quick cost-benefit analysis, obviously it wouldn't make any sense for you to want to provide affordable credit in there, right? But we kept hearing voices from that market itself of the demand that they actually need these things for their trade to actually move on, right? And as soon as we decided to put hat in the ring to actually provide these credits, one of the biggest benefits or positives that we actually got was the customers started speaking about Pesesha and selling Pesesha as a story in that market itself, apart from us having to do heavy marketing, because they were really enthused by the fact that, apart from the fact that they know that we want to provide credit for profit, they know that we clearly took a risk to want to impact their lives directly, right? And those things, those questions would always drop on your table if you're a business operating in a market like this. So based on that storyline, my thought process is this is going to end up being something permanent. The only problem I see there is if the frameworks become too broad, it's probably going to be the big institutions that will end up implementing this because they just have that skill, right? And it leaves out the small institutions, but we just need to remember that those small institutions are a lot closer to the ground than those large institutions are going to be.
Right. And I really like your making the question of whether it's a fad or a force kind of dependent on the way it's implemented, which is the point you've already raised, right? Which is that in some ways it could collapse under its own weight if it proves impossible to implement. But Nicola, what do you think? You've already told us you think this is important, imperative even in some form, but these frameworks, fad or force?
I mean, I think, well, I just choose to treat them as a force. I mean, if it's a fad, we're all pretty doomed. So, I mean, we have to, I'd prefer to stay on the side of shaping them and using them as a force. I think that, so I think that what's important, and I really like, where Daniel's going, which is that, it's quite possible to have a framework that is differently applied to large and smaller companies. It's quite possible to have a framework that is differently applied to, businesses operating in, in developing countries. I mean, these things are all possible in the way that frameworks evolve. And so, people starting to really just apply their, more of us applying ourselves, whether through our practice, whether through our influence in business, whether through our influence with regulators, whether through, whatever our sites of influence are, to shape those frameworks so that they achieve what we really all need them to achieve, which is that, whether you're the pensioner who's invested in the firm that genuinely needs to manage its risks, but also understand that there's no point, in a long-term pension if, your city is flooding and uninhabitable. These are the systemic issues that humans are needing to get our heads around. And these frameworks are our, inadequate, but kind of these multilateral frameworks are inadequate, but kind of only tools to do so collectively. So I just want to keep leaning in on them. And then I think it is about, but it is about bringing the right kind of nuances to them without making them more complicated. So it's not about making them more complicated. It may be about, having less onerous versions, or to your analogy, that if I'm a small business in the global south, I can be an athlete in one area and don't, there can be a materiality test, there can be a applicability test. Excuse me, that's Johannesburg Thunder you're hearing, so I can't manage that. So, I think these are all the kinds of things that are worth, a collective starting to apply their minds to, particularly, I would say, on the S measures that I think are still very unformed. We have the SDGs, but there's very little tie back from SDGs, which are actually positive goals, things that have to happen, and new investment that needs to be made, versus the way S in ESG is currently defined, which is really a set of harms not to be done. I think there's a huge gulf between those two things. So where on the E, we've started to see not just you need to decarbonize, but you also need to actually contribute to carbon stocks. What is that equivalent on the S, right? And there's also a relevance question that I want to introduce around the S when we talk about applicability, even in the do no harm frameworks, just making sure that they don't become exclusionary, right, in the global south. So, if you are saying that it's really important for our global food systems and for our global procurement and supply chain systems that Africa can continue to contribute food into the global supply chain, then it's very important that we also think that smallholder farmers can be part of the global supply chain. And then you've got to say, but when you say you can't have child labor, well, smallholder farmers are households, and they do have children working in fields in the same way as America did in many, many decades and centuries, which is why they have long, school holidays. So, these are things that just need to be understood and managed in our global conversations. But the only place we can do that is if we're negotiating these frameworks. Those are our only mechanism for doing it.
Yeah, I love the argument you're making, which is that they should be a force, but let's lean in to make them more effective forces. I'm hearing you say, and you're calling out particularly some of the S issues, which maybe we can get back to. But Lauren, I just would like to hear you're closer to where some of the standard setting is going on, and what we're hearing from both Daniel and Nicola, different scales of business involved, but is this need to differentiate. Right, to not necessarily add more, but to be clearer on how we allow for difference. So you already told us that in your approach to benchmarking, you go beyond ESGs. How do you see resisting the temptation to just add more and respond to this need to differentiate at the same time as marshalling the force, the positive force that Nicola was talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question, David. Oh, I agree a lot with what Daniel and Nicola had mentioned. And well, I think to your question to them really briefly, like, is this going away or is it going to last? And I think that if we're thinking of ESG kind of in the terms that you introduced it also as corporate sustainability, or the role that corporates have to play in meeting global goals, in meeting these existential risks, or these very real risks that we all face in flooding and climate change and increased inequality, then I think the consensus is yes. And I think that if these ESG frameworks and guidelines can be harnessed, unpacking, again, very much what Daniel said, and in the how, and what Nicola has mentioned, all those nuances, if this starts moving business towards understanding that and moving us towards action in regional, of course, separate regional focuses and applicability in different regions, I think I'm trying to say, then that is so important. And we know also the strength in ESG, and I think the conversation that's happening here is comprehensive around ESG. So Nicola very much pointed to the S, and in her context, S being so important, which I think is absolutely valid. But in the global north, I think a lot of corporates and financial institutions are also talking about how do we holistically look at E, S, and G from where our businesses are, from our vantage point, because we know that to meet global goals, to combat climate change, we won't meet our climate targets with severe inequality existing. We need to look comprehensively against environmental, social, and governance. So I think that, ESG frameworks also being a tool to understand the interlinkages of the challenges that we face and how businesses have the responsibility and the role to help us meet them. I think that's certainly the strength in this whole discussion. But again, I fully agree on the how and the unpacking, and the expectations coming from the North cannot just be a top-down, hello, rest of the world, comply with what we create, because that will absolutely not meet us or get us to meeting again these global goals. That will increase things like certainly a reporting burden and maybe a due diligence burden that goes down supply chains, which doesn't move the needle and which doesn't help us meet climate targets and which doesn't change the reality for smallholder farmers, for example. So lots of complexities there, but I hope that kind of adds, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so it seems pretty clear that across all of you, and this is certainly my view, and by the way, the view of the other people whom we've interviewed as part of this project, is that these frameworks are a material force. And so the question I think we need to wrestle with is how to shape them, how to apply them in the how. And so maybe let's think a bit further. Nicola, you started to decompose the E, the S, and the G, making the point that they are different priorities, right? Let's acknowledge one of the big recent critiques of ESG came from The Economist, right? You probably saw the cover story about The Economist, which in typical Economist style made the provocative statement saying that these frameworks are no longer helpful. And in fact, what it said is, let's just simplify and get away from this kind of elevated and well, they used other words for it as well. But in their case, they said, let's focus on what's most important, and that's E, right? Let's do that right. And clearly E is the area in which there's the most traction. I was looking at the PitchBook investor survey, where overwhelming numbers of investors in the global north are applying ESG, but when you ask where, it's within the area of climate in particular. So the question might be, Nicola, building on your comment there, is there value in the comprehensiveness of having the E, the S, and the G all together, or is there always the risk that they'll end up one or more being emphasized, and as a result, causing unintended, perhaps, but perverse consequences? How do we go about separating out the S, like you were talking about doing, Nicola?
I mean, I think, there are different ways to come at this. I mean, there's tactical ways, there's principled ways. One of the, I attended the World Economic Forum this last year, and it was very apparent to me the trend that you're describing, which is that the E has landed and the S is nowhere. And the G is boring, but it's kind of tucked away in the E somewhere. So I think that, one of the opportunities that I see, one can say, well, that's wrong. And if you're in the global south, that's patently wrong, because actually, we didn't create the E. People in the global south will say, well, we weren't part of the problem in the first place. We still need energy, and we need all our inequality and economic issues tackled. But I think that, if another kind of more tactical view would be, and I suppose it builds off what Lauren had said, which is that, a lot of the carbon sinks in the world are in the global south. And when one understands that actually the solutions that we need in respect of climate change, including, I don't just mean the decarbonization efforts of some large firms, I mean the investment impacts that have an impact on whether we protect carbon sinks, and the business operations that either will or won't protect existing carbon sinks or create new carbon sinks. That when one thinks about those, most of the solutions at this point involve many parts of the global south, and there is an inextricable link between economic inclusion and economic prospect and the ability to protect those carbon sinks. So I think that if one can frame in a different way what Lauren was saying, which is, or just keep getting the message sent that there isn't really an E solution without a bunch of S solutions, then we're in one conversation rather than making them binary or a net or like a zero-sum game, or I'm focusing on one, not the other. I just think that's going to not take us down a useful conversation. I think it's probably easier globally to all agree E is existential, so of course we all care about it. But we actually can't achieve E unless as a global community of humans, we're actually able to understand some of the S factors that contribute to the E challenge.
In other words, Nicola, it's not simply an artifice of history that this term ESG happened to be coined in the UN system about 18 years ago. There actually is a reason why these things are integrated, but ensuring that those come out. Now back to the how. Daniel, I'm interested in your view. So you as a financial institution in Kenya are probably looking at having the IFRS climate disclosure standard coming at you in the next few years, right? That's very likely as it moves down the pike. How do you feel about having an S standard coming down the pike at you as well, potentially after that? By the way, there's no draft of it yet, but that's the logic of the framework as it's rolled out.
I think, frankly, I think this will be quite exciting. And I think I share everything that Nicole actually did mention. I don't think we can actually solve the E in any kind of way if we don't actually solve the S, because for individuals like us that play a role in sub-Saharan Africa, I think that's the biggest headache that we currently have here. Like I said, are we contributing enough to the society? And if we do get to that point where we are contributing enough, and that enough itself can be defined to the society, every other thing kind of automatically takes care of itself, right? So if we do have a standard, and the way Nicole put it, I think is well put, if you can actually define a lot more clearer metrics on that social goals itself, I think all of these conversations will end up being consolidated, and it will be a lot easy for all of us to go in the same direction. So as a business operator, I think it will be quite exciting if we actually do have a stand there, because that standard will be touching on the critical components of us solving the entire headache that we have.
Yes. Okay, so I like that word, excited. That's good to see some passion around doing this. But so we're hearing it's a force, but also it needs to be considered in an integrated fashion. There's a reason why these things are grouped together, but sometimes the way that comes out might be perverse. So I'd like to get to just a moment thinking about building on some of Nicola's points about we need to engage. How do we engage is the question, particularly from the global south. And I've got my eye on the questions here. I don't yet see any questions coming through. So again, we invite those from you as the audience. We're also going to ask you a question yourself about how you're thinking about these opportunities and risks in a moment. But Lauren, let's go to you first on this question of leaning in. You mentioned earlier how your financial system benchmark is predominantly northern companies. Those are large companies. But I know that WBA is looking to engage more southern voice. So how do you think, what's the most constructive way to lean in on helping shape these understandings, even these benchmarks?
Thanks, David. That's a really good question. I should clarify. So our financial system benchmark and the 400 institutions, they're also, so it's more, they're large corporates, but they're also in the global south. So there's insurers, banks, and asset managers, asset owners, also located in the global south. But I think if you look at least in what we're doing in developing these comprehensive methodologies across E, S, and G topics, and I don't want to not answer your current question, but just to go back to also the one you had before, David, on the E, so our financial system benchmark, which we're talking about, but all of ours, we also incorporate a standard set of indicators on the social topics. So we have the same 18 social indicators across all of our benchmarks looking at human rights, decent work, and ethical behavior. And then there's sub-indicators thereunder, but that's basically a signal to say that no matter which theme under the SDGs you're looking at, no matter which sector or grouping of companies, that certainly there's room for materiality and focusing on, what is relevant to your sector and your business, but the S won't go away for any of these topics. So it's integrated therein. So I just wanted to say that quickly. But and then from your global inclusivity perspective, so in developing our methodologies, and since we do apply and benchmark large financial institutions in the global south, for us it was essentially an exercise of listening. So of not just, even though we have a large office, for example, in Amsterdam, knocking on the neighbors' doors and really listening to them, where there's so much happening in the EU around regulation for financial institutions and other corporates, for example. But that's certainly being a big part of the conversation, and learning from that. And you hear the conversation often said the EU is so far ahead, but I don't know if that's always the way to position it. I think there's certain things to learn from the EU, and then we can say, how can that be applied in other regions? How can things be adjusted for the contexts and the challenges and the opportunities that are present in other regions? And certainly the Sustainable Development Goals and science-based norms, globally agreed upon standards like the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So these globally agreed goals, those won't vary. And I think that how those are incorporated into ESG frameworks, into regulations, et cetera, need to be consistent everywhere. But I think that having these conversations across the world, so again, to come back how we're doing things, to hosting this dialogue in regions, having experts on our methodology construction panels located, and really having the experience in the global south as well as the north is essentially how things need to go. And I think as some of these global standards are constructed, I don't know the intricacies of all of their review panels, et cetera, but from what I hear, I think that there's often a bit of a mislink into how they apply these things really across the world and how they can include or exclude institutions in the global south.
Yeah, so the international standard setters should be listening, as you are, as you said, for your own benchmarking and so on. Challenge seems to be on the talking side, right? Because these frameworks are complex. The exposure drafts that come out, for example, IFRS, I had the chance to look at S1 and S2 recently. There's a lot of reading to do there to get into that. And I'm wondering, Daniel, for you as a small financial institution, how do you think about leaning in on shaping these things? Is it shapeable at an international level for you, or do you think it's more about in the jurisdictions you serve? You mentioned in Kenya and West Africa and so on, that you would get involved at that level. And just before you answer, let me just say to the audience as well, let's post that final poll, because we have about 12 or 13 minutes left, about whether you think this is more of a risk or opportunity based on what you've heard. And we'll look at the results in a moment. But Daniel, how do you think about this engaging? If people want to listen, at least if they listen to Lauren, but are you able to talk?
I think that's also another interesting question. I think one of the things that we did identify is it's quite important for us to collate businesses that are like-minded, similar to how we are thinking about this. So although we don't have a formal way we are doing this, but one of the things that we do is at least every 2 months, we usually host what we call a round panel of businesses that are our size, in the same industry, and we present to them the challenges that we have faced for the last 2 months that touches on that S itself. And we ask them thought processes around how are you guys aiming to solve this problem? Then at the end of that meeting, we try to come to like a consensus of, is it possible that we can all do this together, right? The interesting thing is we have seen banks in this market play a role, at least participate in that meetings that we've done. But increasingly, we feel that's most likely the way to go. I mean, we are taking a grassroots approach here, where we have a clear idea that whatever it is that we're doing have a clear impact on society. We want to champion it in this market, and we are bringing individuals together to drive this thing along itself, since we are all providing different kind of solutions that provide that eventually will solve for that S itself. So I guess that's one way by which we are currently engaging.
Got you. Thank you. And also you are taking an active stance to engaging around it. Nicola, what about you? So you've been framed as this bridge between North and South. You mentioned you were at Davos recently. Davos is very much one of those places where stakeholder capitalism metrics are discussed, right? And there are all sorts of indicator sets that have come out from Davos, which are in this universe of thinking. how are you thinking about magnifying that voice or leaning in, as you put it earlier?
So I suppose my first response is that there's no one place. You know, part of the thing about movements and social change or systemic change is that it comes from unusual places, it happens in unpredictable ways. And, the pandemic catapulted us into, a virtual digital, space that accelerated things beyond what we imagined. And so I feel like, I try and think about how those voices get amplified at multiple levels and in multiple places. I think one of them, I think just amongst peers, business to business is a very important thing. I think there's quite a lot of movement building happening in different sectors and in different areas around businesses sort of moving forward, big and small, as Daniel's saying, in their spaces to lead from the front on some of these things. I think the second is, there's certainly, ideally, I think will need to be more regional. If you're talking about the formal multilateral processes, one would hope, for example, either regional formations within an African context or an Asian context or others will, continue to need to try and represent collective interests that can shape these global conversations. But also individual countries can lead from the front, and just set some new benchmarks, and, others get inspired and copy and follow. And so I think that, I would encourage people to participate wherever they feel they have a sphere of influence. And I think that, understanding where you have a sphere of influence and then lean in to exercise that influence because, I think as long as we all understand that in the face of the existential crises that we have, doing nothing is doing something, right? Doing nothing is being part of the problem. There's no neutral ground, I don't think.
Right. Well, it sounds like your imperative message in another form about leaning in, whether locally, domestically, regionally, or internationally. Yeah, so I want to acknowledge there's a question that came in the chat, and then we'll talk about the results of the poll. A question from Annie Bertrand, who's asking how the ISSB standards, or how that body, the board, is aligned with the ESG framework established in Europe and the US. And Annie, maybe I can answer that very briefly. So we can get back in our last few minutes to the risk thing, which is that the ISSB is a new body which has been created under the IFRS framework on the basis of merging a number of other previous bodies, some based in the EU, some based in the US, that had been creating these reporting standards. So in many ways, what we've seen last year, I think, is an inflection point on going from having multiple overlapping standards in disclosure closer to having one set. And we've heard today how that can be a positive thing. It gives some clarity. It can be a risk, which is this risk we've been discussing of, does one size fit all? My size of company, jurisdictional differences, and all the rest, which have been a discussion today. So let's just take a look at the feeling of the audience here. And I'm going to ask my colleagues then to comment on this and perhaps leave us in the last few minutes with their own takeaway about where this discussion needs to go to, building on what we've heard today. So it looks like 50% of the audience have said that this is more of an opportunity. These frameworks are more of an opportunity. 38% sees a real mixture, and 13% are saying it's too early to tell. And I can understand that, because certainly it is relatively early, although in my observation, accelerating rapidly, and particularly in the regulatory enforcement through financial sector authorities in different parts of the world. So those results, it sounds like the way you are leaning, Daniel, you used the word more of an opportunity for possession. What are your concluding thoughts and comments as you see that you seem to persuade the audience? You and Nicola, who said it was an imperative.
I think, Nicola is the expert here. So I think everything that she said so far, I've clearly agreed with literally everything she said. And I'm really grateful to be on the same panel with that. I think, yeah, we also see this as an opportunity. I'm very excited that, and at least let me start with personally, one of the big reasons why I really wanted to work with an African firm was because I clearly identified if we actually want to change anything in sub-Saharan Africa, businesses would have to play a role. And I'm very excited that I'm part of a firm that also thinks that way itself. Now, the idea of making it an opportunity has to be an intentional step. And I call it an intentional step because similar to everything we've said so far, it's very possible that we can actually go the wrong direction here if things get too complex, right? If we can simplify it, if we can bring everybody along, if we can identify, as Nicola mentioned, that social angle is obviously the most critical part there, I think this can easily become an opportunity and we can all pull in the same direction.
Thank you, Daniel. So just heading across my screen here, Lauren, what thoughts from you as we close out, seeing the response from the audience and reflections on today's discussion?
Yeah, thanks, David. So my hope is that it's an opportunity. I very much hope that this conversation around ESG, but broader, maybe if we reframe, and the responsibility of businesses, small, medium, and large, to contribute to the global goals, to contribute and unpack their thinking around how they can contribute to all these risks and opportunities that we face as a global community, again, with those regional nuances and individual rooms for individual conversation. And then I certainly think it's an opportunity. I think there's, in this conversation around the frameworks, and David, we didn't even yet get into things like, in the weeds yet, have regulation, et cetera. There's so much complexity to unpack. And I think each of those sub areas, when we're talking about ESG frameworks, certainly have nuances in terms of risks. Like when you talk about regulation, then it becomes compliance and you need to do it. But when you talk about voluntary frameworks, maybe there is some room to use those as a tool for discussion, starting a journey, setting a strategy across these ESG topics within your organizations, deciding for yourself what kind of organization you want to be and how you want to get there. And I think that's where the real meaning can lie. Although, even WBA is advocating for regulation, there's certainly a place for it. I hope that, in these different buckets, in the weeds of these different buckets of how these topics are being thrown at us, that we can really be applying, I guess, integrated thinking and acting. So some action on how do we move forward to meeting these global goals. And I think that there's such an opportunity there, a tool for discussion and action to move forward.
Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, we could certainly have spent a lot longer. And all these topics have a complexity layer, which is challenging to get to. But thank you. Nicola, your last thoughts as we close out.
So my last thought is that it can feel quite overwhelming and a kind of big elephant, and therefore create a bit of defeatism. I really think we mustn't underestimate that power is very distributed on this issue. Consumers have power, employees have power, and people at all levels of organizations can drive this agenda and keep people honest against this agenda. So I'm just encouraging everybody to think about the role you can play in this overall process, rather than assume it's happening in a corner somewhere in Geneva or Washington or somewhere else.
Thanks, Nicola. Well, it seems consistent with what I think we've heard from across the panel today, that while there are risks, certainly when things are regulated, there always are risks and there always are unintended consequences. I would summarize the message I've heard actually from all three of you, but in different ways, is to say, is it a risk or opportunity? Well, let's make it an opportunity, right? Which is different from saying it is one. It's saying it requires that engagement, some of the leaning in, some of the prioritization, frankly, some of the time and the share of mind, whether at a local level, regional, or international. So we hope, if nothing else, the discussion today encourages each of you as you have those opportunities to engage. And we look forward to further discussions on the issue. Let me close by thanking the panelists today, Nicola, Lauren, and Daniel. Thank you very much for your time, and to the organizers. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.